Although I found the month of June was a poor month for going round the islands in my 4-metre inflatable boat, the forecast predicted a heat wave over the summer Solstice weekend. I readied the boat and bought in food supplies for a multi-day trip, heading out to sea. But as the days drew closer, though it was still going to be very warm, the predicted number of days with light winds dropped to 3. So I decided to stay in home waters and camp out in the wee out-the-way bay in Loch Etive. I had not camped there since early spring, and the local coos had trashed it by dropping their cowpats all over the place, so I was actually looking forward to staying there again. It was a low-tide beach launch at Kelly's Pier, which is not the best time to launch as the water is very shallow. I get around this by dropping the boat off its trailer, then waiting the tide to turn and float it while I dump the car and trailer at home. By the time I get back, the boat is afloat and I'm ready to go. It was a rather uninspiring morning for the start of a heat wave on a summer solstice weekend, but I happily headed round the bay, slowly trawling a lure in the hope of catching my supper. Although I had beef burgers with me, they were frozen solid, as I'd kept them in the deep freeze overnight, and that gives me an extra day keeping them fresh enough to eat. So a tasty trout would spin my food out. Although this part of the loch had been very productive for me the past few weeks, I didn't get so much as a nibble this time around, so I turned about and headed up the loch towards my campsite. I only hoped the coos would be well away from where I pitched the tent, or if they were in the vicinity I would pitch my tent elsewhere, simply because I don't sleep well in my tent when the coos are close for fear of them trampling on me as I lie on the ground, and then they crap on top of my gear just to rub things in. I'm certainly not afraid of coos, but when I see the size of Dad's danglers, the last thing I want to see is his hairy ass standing on top of me as I sleep in my sleeping bag below. So you can imagine my delight seeing them in Caddersley Bay, several miles away from my campsite, so I knew I would sleep well that night. I happily headed on my way towards the wee out-the-way bay. And then I was there, back in my promised land. No sooner had I landed, my neighbours, the 2 swans, came to greet me. They sniffed around for a while, but left again as I don't feed them now. I then headed over to my tent pitch, knowing full well I'd have to do some work before I could use it again. It was well overgrown. I was prepared though, so put on a pair of thick gardening gloves and started to pull the bracken out. It was warm work as the sky was clearing and the temperatures rising rapidly. The forecast of 25 degrees centigrade for the next few days had started to arrive. My next job was to clear the cow crap away. I used a discarded piece of hardboard to shovel it up, then scattered gravel over the places it had been. It was thirsty work, so once the campsite was clear, I set up my chair and had a well-earned coffee. Although I was very hot, I initially kept my launching trousers on to keep the bugs off my tender legs. There were few midges around, but the clegs which bite hard were everywhere. After my break, I put the tent up. And finally I felt at home again, so celebrated the occasion with another coffee, as I sat back and admired familiar surroundings. Everything was the same as it always is out here, which is why I love this place. It's so predictable and so peaceful. I lazed around the campsite that afternoon, slowly slurping a Guinness while the drone did its thing. It was now late afternoon, and I suspected it was a perfect time to catch a sea trout or three. I clambered back into my boat and headed off over the flat, calm water. I enjoy watching the scenery float by as much as catching fish. I have absolutely no interest in catching spurtbug or pollock, which most fishermen in Etive seem to target. If it's not got pink flesh, I'm not interested, but I appreciate that's just me. It was warm work, so I slurped an Indian pale ale as I waited for an unsuspecting trout to scoff my lure. And I didn't need to wait long, as within 15 minutes from leaving camp I had my first fish in the line. I could tell almost immediately it was a nice sized fish. It didn't struggle much, but decided to keep on swimming as if nothing had affected it. However, that changed once it saw my boat and the fight began. If it had been much bigger, I would need to get a bigger net, if you can pardon the Jaws pun. It was a lovely fish. It was a short evening's fishing trip for me, as within another 10 minutes, I had another fish. Then, when I caught the third, all within 45 minutes of leaving camp, I decided enough was enough and headed back to the tent. I landed, cleaned the fish, and if it had been a little earlier, I would have nipped home and popped them in the deep freeze. But as I was now looking forward to late supper, I popped them into a large plastic container I keep at camp. It was filled with Loch water and left so the incoming tide would also help keep them fresh. My plan was being to head home early morning and freeze them then. I then settled down to cook supper. Yep, my favourite red flesh cow meat. Beef burger with gravy. It made a pleasant change from trout, as I have eaten that many lately. Even my poo is turning a little pink. The following morning was weather perfect, and at 6 a.m. I was heading for home to freeze the fish. I passed a kayak floating down the middle of the loch, so went to investigate. Its paddle was neatly stowed in the cockpit, so I presumed the high tide carried it off. I didn't tow it to shore, as I knew I could tow it into the wrong shore. Instead, I took a note to check it out in more detail on my way back to camp. I then passed another gently floating down the loch. Again, its paddle neatly stowed, so that confirmed to me they were taken away by the high tide. I took the fish home and mentioned it to the many campers at Tainault Beach that 2 kayaks were drifting in the loch. Heading back, I saw a couple of tents with 2 guys waving, trying to attract my attention. I immediately knew it was their kayaks. I went to see them and told them that there is no room in the boat. I was willing to go and tow the nearest kayak back. Then they could paddle after the other, which they gratefully appreciated. They mentioned they thought someone must have set them afloat during the night. I was going to say the coos can't push kayaks, but I was polite and replied, "No need to tell me what happened, you guys will know the truth," and I left it at that, continuing on my way to catch my breakfast sea trout. It was one of these perfect mornings when reflections were motionless. My patience paid off and breakfast took the bait. And as it was cooked and then ate, the drone took off for a wander around the breakfast bar. I can't think of a more perfect way or delightful place to have a late breakfast. The heat wave was now at its peak, and as I was feeling very warm, I headed for the shores at Dow to cool off and clean myself. The loch is exceptionally warm this year, and it almost felt like having a warm bath. It was certainly a very refreshing and relaxing experience. I then enjoyed a slow stroll along the shore, allowing the warm breeze to dry myself off. The drone, however, was feeling a lot more energetic, so flew along the shore and then above the wooded area beside the stream at Dow. I spent 3 fantastic days over the summer solstice period, just chilling out in the wee out-of-the-way bay during the heatwave. It's times like this that I remember during the long, cold, dark months of winter, and it's hard to believe, but slowly and surely the darker days will come again, now the solstice is over. I hope you enjoyed the video, and thanks for watching.